for today's Fan Friday. Today, this session, we are managing imposter syndrome, and we are here with Phyllis Njoroge, who studied cognitive and brain sciences at Tufts University, software engineering at the Flatiron School, and women's entrepreneurship at Cornell University. Phyllis offers an in-depth perspective on the challenges of imposter syndrome at the individual, company, and societal level. In her published 5-star book, From Fraud to Freedom, Phyllis dedicates herself to inspiring a growth mindset so that we all may reach our fullest potential. You want to pay close attention because the giveaway winner will not only receive a $100 gift card, but a copy of Phyllis's 5-star rated book, From Fraud to Freedom. So with that being said, let's give all the love, all the chat, all the emojis to Phyllis.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Phyllis, as mentioned. Glad y'all are here. Welcome. And to start, we're gonna have a poll. As mentioned, I have a 5-star book on imposter syndrome, so we're gonna have a poll related to that. And the question of the poll is like, what has your experience with imposter syndrome been? So feel free to drop in there and let me know, and I look forward to your thoughts. In the meantime, I want to leave as much time for Q&A as possible, so I'm going to share my screen and get started. Hopefully everyone can see this. Let me know if you cannot, but as mentioned, I'm Phyllis. I actually was a member of Color Stack way back when it first started, so I'm really happy to be back here as a speaker talking to you all. And I first wanted to give you an overview of what we'll talk about, which is who am I, like who is this person talking to you, what is imposter syndrome, because related to the poll question, preparing for internships, which I know is a lot of your experience currently, and then tips for imposter syndrome and Q&A. So first, who am I? You can't tell I'm the person in this photo. And who is that person? So I went to Tufts. I was a cognitive and brain sciences student. And then I ended up working as a product manager and ultimately became an author on imposter syndrome. And I also speak on it, clearly, because we're talking about it now. And my experiences with imposter syndrome first started with experiencing imposter syndrome myself. When I was in college, I'd gone from being a straight A student to failing my first exam in college. So I was like, oh my God, yeah, I don't know if I've got what it takes like I thought I did. And that's how I first started to learn about what imposter syndrome was and what it felt like. And I talked about imposter syndrome at a first gen summit. I'm first gen. I was first gen low income in college. And at a first gen summit, I talked about imposter syndrome and realized how important that topic is for so many people. And ultimately that led me to keep talking about it on LinkedIn after I graduated. And then from there, realizing that it resonated so much, I ended up writing a book on it. You might be familiar with the phrase, that book could have been an article. I had the opposite issue where it's not all gonna fit in the article. So I ended up writing a book on it. And now it's a book that is out in the world, and as you can see, linked if you're interested as well. But if you want to literally look at it right now, these are the table of contents. So From Fraud to Freedom, I designed the cover. Yellow is like one of my favorite colors. It's the theme for my apartment. You can't tell because I'm in this corner, but I promise you the furniture everywhere is yellow. So talking about imposter syndrome, not faking it until you make it, letting go of perfectionism, asking questions, practicing positivity, embracing compliments. And then the chapters that are really powerful for me are the chapters on imposter syndrome and race, imposter syndrome and gender, and imposter syndrome and being first gen, all of which have applied to my experience and make imposter syndrome a little bit different. And then as well for those who are mentors or managers, managing those with imposter syndrome. And then lastly, company culture's responsibility, because it's not all in your head, it's actually a part of the company culture. That being said, I won't be able to get into all of those details today, so I will try to focus this on y'all's experience, which is, trying to figure out, oh my God, what am I gonna do for the rest of your life? I'm gonna spoil it for you and tell you that you're not gonna have the answer figured out at this point, but we can try and figure it out. So before I get into that, the poll had been asking, have you experienced imposter syndrome, or do you even know what that is? So if you're not familiar, I will literally define it for you right now. So I define imposter syndrome as doubt that becomes attached to your identity, right? So it can be one thing to doubt yourself on a specific assignment, but then it becomes imposter syndrome when you doubt whether you should, for in my case, be a product manager in the first place, whether you should be at the company or the school or involved in the organization, or whether you belong in this industry. So it ends up folding into a sense of belonging rather than just doubt contained to a specific experience. So for example, for me, that means when I got to school and I had gone from being a straight A student to failing my first exam, it's okay for me to feel like, oh, this is hard material. I'm doubting myself on the material. But once I started questioning whether I could even go to belong at that school or whether I could even graduate, now we're talking about identity experiences and imposter syndrome. So what triggers it is a question that I get very often. Unclear expectations, right? Lack of support, and you might experience this as you go through different work experiences. Lack of support, being thrown on the deep end, perfectionism and pressure to excel, often coming from family or from ourselves. And then microaggressions also very much influence imposter syndrome. And then coming from a different background, as I mentioned, I'm first gen, low income. I'm also Kenyan. I was born in Nairobi, right? So being an international student, coming from a different major, maybe you have a different educational background, like you were homeschooled, or later in your career, if you decide to switch careers, or right now you might be switching majors. Race, gender, sexuality, neurodivergent, anything that feels like a difference can make us feel like we don't belong, and then that creates the sense of feeling like I'm an imposter. And then lastly, thinking that you should learn without mistakes. So some of y'all might know Jodi Ann Gurry. She wrote a really popular Harvard Business Review article on imposter syndrome. And something she says about imposter syndrome that I really love is imposter syndrome is pathologizing learning, right? So not giving yourself the opportunity to learn and thinking that you should be perfect and not make mistakes and things shouldn't be hard and you should have everything figured out, when really at the end of the day, we're all learning and growing in the process, and we're not going to have everything figured out, and allowing ourselves to give and receive grace as we figure it out. So imposter syndrome tips, I will breeze through these so we can get to the internship part, and then we can get to Q&A, because I think the most impactful part of any talk is applying it to your own specific experience, and I think that happens best with Q&A. So imposter syndrome tips, your priority needs to be learning. As I mentioned, something that people experience with imposter syndrome is thinking that just because they're learning, they don't belong or they're not capable, when in reality, everyone, including myself, is always learning. Even the people that you see as perfect or have it all together, they're also learning on their own journey and not something to compare. So sometimes we end up comparing ourselves because we want to figure out, where should I be? Like, what does good look like? What does bad look like? And we get those answers from comparing ourselves to other people, when in reality, we're just on our own path. We can use other people for inspiration, but we shouldn't necessarily use other people for condemnation, because those people aren't us and we're not them. And we don't share life experience, even if we share some similarities. So trying to understand, what can I benefit from things that other people have learned, but not thinking that just because I'm not in a certain place in life or haven't received a certain experience yet, that there's something inherently wrong with me when I'm just on a different path. Something that comes up a lot with imposter syndrome is deflecting compliments, not celebrating successes, or minimizing opportunities. So a tip that I really love is taking pride in accomplishing something, even if it was harder or more time consuming than expected, or if it was easier than expected, right? Sometimes people will spend all day studying for something and then take the test, and then the test is easier than they expect. And then when they get a good grade, they're like, oh, whatever, it was easier than I expected anyway, so this good grade isn't that big of a deal. When whether something is easier than you expect or harder than you expect, it doesn't change the amount of effort you put into the process, and trying to remember to celebrate all of your achievements, regardless of how the path to those achievements was different than you might have expected. For example, if you take 6 years to graduate instead of 4, when you graduate, you're still worth celebrating that achievement, because it still took a lot of effort and work on your part. And then something that I appreciate is, if you find something helpful, proactively share it with others. This presentation is an example of that, right? I found things that have helped me with my imposter syndrome. Now I'm sharing that with others, aka don't gatekeep. That's really important. And then setting up an accomplishment journal to track all the achievements, right? Our brains filter for whatever we're looking for, and you'll forget a ton of things that you've accomplished while you're still focused on all the things that you haven't accomplished yet. And so actively writing that down, being like, this is what I did this month, this is what I did this semester, not only helps you with your resume, but also helps you to realize that you're making a lot of progress and you've come really, really far while you're focused on making the next thing happen. Something that I really appreciate is praising efforts over outcomes. We can't necessarily control the outcome of every scenario. So for example, as I mentioned, that test that you study for, the actual questions that end up on the test, who knows what's going to happen? You apply for an internship, whether you get an offer, that's up to somebody else. But how much practice you put into your interviews, how well you put together your case, how much you studied for your exam, those are part of your effort. And so trying to focus on praising your efforts instead of your outcomes, because the only thing that's truly in your control is your effort as opposed to the outcome that depends on other people. Something that I had a really hard time with in college and now, but I'm a lot better at it now, is attempting all parts of a project before saying you can't do it. Fun fact, in my first computer science class, did not turn in the final because I thought I couldn't do it. And then my professor was like, can you at least try to do all parts of the final before you say you're not gonna do it? And then I was like, oh, fine, because you asked me personally, I will do it as a favor to you. Obviously, it was a favor to my GPA, but whatever, that's not what it felt like at the time. And so I did. And I did not get an A, I did not get a B, I did not get a C, I did not get a D. I failed. And usually when people try to tell you inspiring stories, they want everything to work out, right? Like I only worked for 5 minutes and I made $1 million next week. That's not how it happens. I procrastinated on this project. My professor was like, can you at least attempt it? My attempt was very weak because my mind was not in the right place. However, I failed with a 50% instead of a 0%. And your mind, you might be like, well, Phyllis, they're both failing. But when you average out grades and you had a 50% on an assignment and got all the points, half of all the points for that assignment, that changes your final grade. So I actually still ended up getting an even better final grade than I thought I was going to, because I at least attempted it, right? And so my mentality was like, oh, well, if I'm not going to get the best grade ever, I'm just not going to do it. And that would have caused me to have an even worse final grade because then I turned in literally nothing, right? So in approaching life and approaching anything, at least attempt all of the parts before thinking that you can't do it, and understand a 50% is better than a 0%. And in reality, we're not going to get 100% on everything, but that doesn't mean that the appropriate answer when we aren't capable of getting 100% is getting a 0%, which is clearly what I thought. And then lastly, as you heard, I failed my first exam. I failed my comp sci final. I failed a ton of things, but I still graduated with honors from a top university. So what does that mean? You'll be fine. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. It seems super stressful in the moment, but ultimately all of those things, if you think about this, life is long and you have many opportunities to keep growing and learning and changing. And that one assignment that you don't do as well as you want to on, or that one internship that you didn't get, is not the end all be all to your life. So speaking of internships, let's move on to that. Quick tips for internships, what to do when you land one, and what to do when you don't get one that you wanted. So when you don't land an internship, knowing it's not personal, like I said, your effort is different than the outcome because other people influence the outcome. And so having your life story be determined by a bunch of strangers who looked at your resume while they were tired waiting in line at Starbucks and decided to reject you is not fair, because they don't know you. They don't genuinely know your potential. They don't genuinely know your story and achievements. So when you allow other people to dictate your life that just looked at a resume or just interviewed you for an hour, you're unfairly putting the power of your story in someone else's hands. So understanding it's not personal because it can't be personal because they don't really know you. Part one. Part two, cry. Or at least for me, I'll cry about it. Cry and then grow, right? Sometimes people like to brush things off as if it doesn't affect them, which is really just pushing the feelings until later in the future. It's okay to be upset about something that you didn't get, because at the end of the day, you cared about it. And when you care about it, something, it affects you emotionally. So allowing yourself to grieve the loss, because it's a loss in a way, but not making that loss final, and figuring out how to grow from the opportunity. Oh, y'all cannot see that? Okay, my bad. It was not framed properly. Celebrating your efforts, which I talked about previously. So understanding that the effort you put into something matters more than other people's final decisions on that, because final decisions can be changed. And final decisions from other people you don't control. You only control yourself and your actions. And then something I'd mentioned earlier is when you compare yourself to people to feel bad about yourself, you're taking the highlights of their life and assuming that there's nothing going on in the background, while in reality, you're taking all the negatives of your life and filtering out all the highlights and achievements. So understanding that when you compare yourself to other people, use that to stay inspired rather than to condemn yourself. Like ask them like, hey, how did you get this opportunity? And be able to learn from them rather than being envious. And then if you didn't land an internship, make your own experience. Go volunteer somewhere, develop your skills independently with personal projects or helping your community, because there are a lot of people who benefit from your skills that aren't just Google, right? So it's like your local businesses, your local organizations, even people in your family. There's a lot of ways to develop experience that aren't formal structures from your dream entity. And then also understanding if Google didn't say yes today, it's okay, come back. Next year and the year after that and the year after that and the year after that. I'm not kidding. If you search LinkedIn, there's so many people who say, after applying 17 times to Google, I finally got in. So like, if you think the first time that they say no, Google's just an example. Obviously, whatever company you want to put in here, you can put in. But if you think the first time they say no is the end all be all and is a lifetime rejection, that's not how this works. The next time they post something, apply again and just keep coming back until they finally say yes. So that's why I said 6 times the charm, because I know someone who took 6 years to get into Google, but they finally got it, and that's what matters. So if you did land an internship, remembering to ask questions, right? Pursuing help is an act of courage. An internship is not the time to prove that you can run the whole company. It's a time to learn. That's literally what internships are for. So if you're not asking questions, you're not trying to learn, and you're missing out on the benefits of an internship. Meeting people, right? So once you're in a company, take the initiative to meet people from different teams and departments and maintain those relationships for a lifetime. Like one of my mottos is the world is not small, communities are small, right? When people are like, oh, small world, it's not a small world, it's a small community. So thinking about how the people you meet today could influence your life 10, 20 years from now. So not burning bridges and building relationships, even if you don't meet them immediately. And then use the internship to reflect and adjust what you want out of life and out of your career. If you're like, honestly, I didn't really like working on this team, think about like why, and then have that inform what type of teams you look for in the future. And then remembering that the goal is to learn. So focus on learning, not attempting to be perfect, and keep that journal of all your accomplishments because you need it for your resume. And also you need it for your self-esteem. That being said, keep in touch. Like I just said, life is long, communities are small, relationships last a lifetime. So please reach out to me on LinkedIn or directly, because we have a lounge after this. So I'm happy to hang out and talk then as well. And just using LinkedIn in general to reach as many people as possible. And on that note, thank you and questions. This will be an adventure. Let me figure out how to see the questions. Or are y'all gonna read the questions to me? Let me know. Oh, lovely. The questions appear on screen. How does imposter syndrome manifest differently across various identities and backgrounds? So I actually just published a workbook on imposter syndrome while Black. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. Even though everybody experiences imposter syndrome, right? So fun fact around the original research said that high achieving women experience imposter syndrome. And then eventually they're like, just kidding, it's women and men, just kidding, it's women and men and children. So the more they looked into it, the more they're like, we narrowed this too much because it affects everyone. So that being said, even though it affects everyone differently and the causes are different, right? If you go to work and someone is like, oh, you came from Howard? How did you get this internship? That's gonna make you feel away, right? Because there's like a microaggressive tone in that question, right? So then it's like, even if you and your peer are both experiencing imposter syndrome, they aren't getting those microaggressive questions, right? So they're experiencing imposter syndrome from a different set of triggers from your triggers. So like understanding that even though the symptoms will manifest the same, right? You might be afraid of being found out as a fraud. You might be afraid to ask questions. You might not go for certain opportunities because you don't think you'll be able to execute them perfectly. The causes will be different. So for example, your coworkers assuming you are a diversity hire rather than thinking that you were really skilled and must have had an impressive background, like those types of doubts being projected onto you will manifest, right? So the identity piece doesn't necessarily come in because it changes the impact of the imposter syndrome, but it changes what triggers it because we aren't all experiencing the same triggers. Or like if you come from a different background, let's say you're an international student and you're presenting at work and someone's like, oh my God, your English is so great. You're so articulate. Okay, well, I appreciate that, right? So now you might have, like, you might be experiencing doubt around presenting because you're like, oh, I think people don't expect me to talk well. And it's like, that's their problem. Like, that's their own projection onto your own life, right? So your background and identity is changing how the imposter syndrome comes up. But now the impact is the same where you don't want to present as much the next time. So catching that in the moment when something is triggering your imposter syndrome, asking yourself, what is the cause of this trigger? And is that cause true or justified or a projection of other people's biases? And often it's a projection of other people's biases. Next question. What role does self-compassion play in overcoming imposter syndrome? Self-compassion is everything, right? So if you're not familiar with compassion, like compassion is extending love and empathy and care towards yourself, right? So understanding, let's say you make a mistake. Let's say, I don't know, you're working on a code base at work and you actually accidentally delete something. Yikes, right? Self-compassion will come into play in terms of saying, understanding that I deserve empathy too, right? So like if you would empathize with another person and say, hey, mistakes happen, things happen, let's figure out how to prevent this. Because first of all, it was way too easy to make that mistake. We should probably have more security in play here. But also, I'm going to give myself grace because it wasn't intentional and I'm going to try and learn from the experience, right? So every time you are experiencing imposter syndrome, sometimes it's coming up because you did something imperfectly or you made a mistake or there's an opportunity that you didn't go for because you didn't feel worthy of it. Understanding that that's an experience that most people have and giving the same kind of empathy you give to someone else to yourself. And because you are a person too, and then trying to move forward from the situation instead of self-condemning. But there's a lot more answers around that, right? Self-compassion is a hefty topic. Imposter syndrome is a hefty topic. So I'm happy to go into more detail if people want to reach out directly about that. How do you gauge the way you ask questions at an internship? I heard asking too many questions is a red flag. This is a perfect question. I'm so excited about this. So something I talk about in my book is when you ask questions, the right way to ask questions is to ask a question, explain everything you've already done to try and answer the question for yourself, and then say, is my understanding correct, right? So people are like, there's no stupid questions. Unfortunately, somebody's gonna think you're stupid depending on the questions you ask. That's gonna happen if you ask a question that's already written down somewhere, but you didn't bother to try and look, right? If you ask a question that's easily Googleable, but you didn't try to search for it. If you tried to search for it, if you already read all of your documents and your onboarding videos and you couldn't find the answer, then you can say, hey, I went through these following resources. I couldn't find something on this. Would you be able to clarify because my current understanding is X? So this shows you're already doing your work. You're not waiting for other people to hand you answers. It shows the resources you already looked through so somebody can be like, oh, I forgot to give you a certain resource, or why doesn't that document have that information? It should, right? So that can help other people understand what gaps are missing also. And then it shows that you tried to come to an understanding of an answer, but want clarification rather than you're just showing up waiting for someone else to give you an answer to the question. Hopefully that helps. Tips that could help in reducing imposter syndrome. Hopefully you saw those slides. If you didn't, highly recommend From Fraud to Freedom. Highly recommend the slides. And if there's specific scenarios you have questions on, happy to ask those, answer those either later in the lounge or if you want to reach out directly. I can't tell how many are left. How was your experience writing the book? It was terrible. It was a lot of work. It ruined my weekends. It's not cute. And if I had known how bad it was going to be to spend my entire life rereading the same page over and over trying to make edits, I probably wouldn't have started writing a book. But thankfully, I didn't know that at the time. And I put one foot in front of the other and was miserable and complained the other entire time. Asked my best friend, she knows, because I'll text her and be like, why am I reading this book right now instead of at the club? That's crazy. But, work hard, no playing. There was no playing. It was just working hard and working hard. But now I'm at peace because I'm a published author. So sometimes you just got to know when something's worth it eventually. Keep your head down, focus, be upset, hate it the entire time, but then you'll be really proud of yourself when it's done. Lovely. Next question. How do you know when it's imposter syndrome versus unprepared unqualifiedness? Imposter syndrome is when you are doubting yourself despite being a high achiever. And because of those doubts, you impede yourself from growing. And growing looks like asking questions. Growing looks like looking for new opportunities. Growing looks like attempting all parts of a project that seem hard, right? So unprepared and unqualified and imposter syndrome can be together. You can be unprepared and unqualified and be experiencing imposter syndrome, but the imposter syndrome is making you doubt whether you can ever be qualified, right? When I got into college, I knew nothing about cognitive and brain sciences. I graduated with honors studying cognitive and brain sciences. I was unprepared. I was unqualified. And then I had to get qualified by believing that I can grow and learn and have new experiences that add to my achievements. But the imposter syndrome would have been me being like, I don't think I can do this major. Just kidding, never mind, I'm dropping out. So that's the difference for me. It's like, are you, even if you are unprepared or unqualified currently, is that going to stop you from earning the qualifications because you don't think you're worth doing that? Or are you going to go for new and higher opportunities knowing that you're capable of growing even if you're currently unprepared? Part one. Part two, if you want to assess if you're unprepared or unqualified, part one, I would say there's always more room to grow, right? There's always a reason why someone is unqualified for something, as far as I'm concerned. Part two, against what rubric? If you want to say you're unprepared or unqualified, where is the rubric that you're comparing yourself to? And if there's none, then like, I don't know, I can't tell you because you're making up the rubric in your head. But if you're looking at a list of requirements and you don't meet the list of requirements, you need to go get those requirements and then go for the opportunity. But imposter syndrome will be you looking at that list of requirements, being like, I can't do this, and then you never go for it, versus having a growth mindset, which is the opposite of imposter syndrome, is looking at a list of requirements and being like, whew, this is a lot, but I can do it and I will. And then eventually you did it. Next question. Are we time? Okay, this is the last one, I guess, if we're at time. Since comparison is the thief of joy and comparison is the main issue I face due to imposter syndrome, how do you work on not comparing yourself to others? One, you don't know everything about everyone's life, right? So like, for example, if you try to write a book and you're sitting there on a Tuesday evening and you hate it, you're miserable, you don't like editing, it's not fun, you might not know that that's exactly what I went through when I was writing a book. So then you take that experience and say, well, writing a book is too hard, never mind, I'm not going to do it. Versus if you realize, oh, other people have this experience too, I guess this is just part of the process, and then you keep going. So like, when I think about comparing myself to others, it's, am I comparing myself to them to look for inspiration? Am I comparing myself to them to look for motivation? Am I comparing myself to look for a reason to keep going? Or am I comparing myself to look for a reason to be a hater? Like, that's like my only criteria. I don't think comparing yourself is inherently wrong. It's the incentive and the reason you're doing it. Are you doing it to build community? Are you doing it to find a reason to keep pushing forward? Are you doing it to literally just be a hater, whether a hater towards someone else or a hater towards yourself, you're still being a hater at the end of the day. If you're like, oh, I hate myself because I'm not as good as her, you're being a hater towards yourself, right? So it's like, I'm not saying don't compare yourself. I'm saying understand what your motivations are for comparing yourself, and then find motivation in other people's stories rather than condemnation in other people's stories. Because I compare myself to Beyonce every day, not to make myself feel bad, but I know she has great work ethic. So whenever I'm thinking about Beyonce, I'm thinking about great work ethic, and that keeps me going. So the comparison is like fuel rather than me setting myself on fire and like crying in ashes. If that makes sense. But yes, that was the last question. I hope there's a way for me to look at the rest of the questions and answer them. But we'll just end on the note of compare yourself to Beyonce and call it a day.
Yes, thank you so much, Phyllis. Y'all, give Phyllis all the love in the chat, all the emojis. I hope you're feeling the love. Before we go, we're gonna go ahead and ask a giveaway question. All right, so let's do the giveaway question. What mentality effectively helps with feelings of imposter syndrome? Okay, I saw it. Denise. Denise, Denise, Denise. Ooh. Let me make sure we got it. Caleb, did you get that? Awesome. Congrats, Denise. Thank you so much, Phyllis. We really appreciate you sharing and continue being amazing. Thank you so much. Y'all, we are going to go ahead and transition into 15 minutes of roundtables in the lounge space. Phyllis will be hanging out in the social lounge to answer any questions that you didn't get to in the Q&A. And join us at 3:45 to hear about the current Color Stack members and how they've brought their identities to work at places like LinkedIn, Bank of America, and Bloomberg. All right, y'all, I will see you at 3:45.